Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War Frontline Update for the 2nd of December 2024. The last time I did a Frontline Update was on the 30th of November and was probably using mapping that was a little bit before that. So point being, this is probably a 3-day mapping update at least, so they expect there to be quite a lot of changes to the front line. Sorry, I just hadn't had time to do it previously. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen at the moment and pause the video to look at the key there. Suffice to say that I am synthesizing two mappers here, and both mappers have the Russian defensive lines, the blue line for Andrew Perpetua and broadly orangey red line for Suriyak maps, and each mapper has pins that refer to, or I've put pins, or JR has enabled pins to be put in place to suggest movements of the Russian defensive line one way or the other. So for example, here we have the Kursk region, and Suriyak maps has shown that the previous mapping of the Kursk showed that the Russians were here, and they have moved their defensive line further to the east here, or the southeast here, and likewise they have taken an area of land over here, moving to take this orange area north of Martianovka or Martianivka, and that is the changes to the mapping there. That's Suriyak maps. Andrew Perpetua shows no mapping change there, so there is a difference of opinion in this area. Now I'm going to go to the to my website that Bennie Pie has put together. It's the ATP Distilled website. If you go to the more section and the ISW Daily AI report, that's where AI has taken the ISW Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, and distilled that report even further. There's a few anecdotes I want to go through. First of all, Russian forces are using powerful electronic warfare systems in Kursk to cover and facilitate their own assault operations, so the Russians really using EW there. The Oskil river has not yet frozen, and the Russian forces currently do not have sufficient forces and means to expand the scale of their offensive operations to seize Kupyansk. So we're going to come across from Kursk there. We are going to come back to here in a second, but I'm just going to talk about the Oskil river that comes down through Kursk there, through Kupyansk here. And that not having frozen over yet makes it more difficult for the Russians to get across there. They have been pushed back in this area, losing some territory that they pushed into Kupyansk there. But still some difference of opinion between the mappers in that area. What else does the ISW say? A Ukrainian artillery reconnaissance battalion commander operating in the Prokrosk direction stated that Russian forces continue attempts to advance near Zhovte and Lysivka and along the nearby railway lines toward Prokrosk in groups of 20 to 30 personnel, and will attack again 30 to 40 minutes after being repelled. Continuous meat assaults that are taking place down in the Prokrosk area over here, where you can see they are having some success. They're moving slowly, inching further forward towards the Ukrainian city of Prokrosk here. So just trying to see where Zhovte is. I don't know that I can see that around here anywhere particularly, but anyway, the Russians making some gains in the Prokrosk area. And then finally, from the ISW that I wanted to point out, the spokesman for the Ukraine's South Volunteer Army reported that despite Russian information operations claiming otherwise, Russian forces currently do not have the forces and means for a large-scale offensive on Dnipro or Zaporizhia cities. There are some claims that the Russians are readying for a large counteroffensive in Zaporizhia area, possibly up through Robotyne area up here, maybe further to the east, but they won't have enough forces to get to Zaporizhia or certainly to Dnipro. But they are making these advances around the southeastern corner of that front line. Right, let's go back up now to Hliuboke and Lipsy area just north of Kharkiv. Apparently here the Russians have been pushed back a wee bit around Hliuboke. So this is Greyskull reporting that the AFU has advanced in the Hliuboke area. So that is, you can see right into the middle of that settlement. Where we look at the map here, that is the Ukrainians control all of this land there, or at least the Russians have been pushed back. Well, actually no, it does have the Ukrainians controlling that So I presume, does that yellow mean that Ukraine is controlled, or is that no man's land between the Russian and the Ukrainian lines here? Not too sure on their map, but either way, Russians have been pushed back, so their line would be along this. You see that road there? That is where the Russians would be pushed back to. Not shown on either of the two mappers we have here, though, but just bear in mind that the Russians might have been pushed back there. Andrew Perpetua was talking about how the lack of attacking around Vovchansk by the Russians has been a result of the Kursk invasion force here, the Ukrainians pushing into the Russian territory, and that forcing the Russians to pull out from places like here. It's been relatively quiet for the Russians here. They haven't really advanced anywhere in this kind of vicinity, a little bit over here that we've not heard of since. But generally speaking, the lack of Russian attacks here is potentially down to the Ukrainians attacking in Kursk. Right, then we're going to go to the Oskil River and look at, we've got an ISW, actually, George Barros from ISW, talking about the Russians trying to push across the Oskil over here. We can see that Suriyak Maps has the Russians gaining across the river and further gaining actually around Maziotivka, really getting across the river there, and that is across and up the bluffs here. So this is very serious. So I don't know how they've managed that, whether they got through the middle there, but that is serious. Both mappers agreeing that the Russians have got there towards the Padne. That is, I think, a major concern for me, because I thought those bluffs would be holding the Russians back. Barros here says that Russian forces in Kharkiv are making some interesting moves around the Oskil River near Kupyansk. We assessed Russian advances northwestward over the Oskil River, east of Dvorichna in Kharkiv Oblast, given a Ukrainian military official acknowledged that the Russian forces crossed the Oskil River east of Dvorichna. So this is Maziotivka, and it's further to the north where he's talking about, which is over in that area. That's Dvorichna. There's Dvorichne over this side. It could be here they're referring to, but it's this one to me that's more worrying, further to the south around here. And you can see it is just across the river there. So the ISW does have that noted there. That's your worry across that bluff line that comes down there. Okay. So George Barroson says, furthermore, the Ukrainian General Staff, here we go. No, actually, that's further down near Kupyansk. Sorry. Ukrainian General Staff acknowledged that the Russian forces conducted attacks on the west bank of the Oskil River near Hliuboke, northwest of Kupyansk, and Hliuboke and Kindrashivka, both immediately north of Kupyansk. In other words, if we come down here, we see that they are attacking across the river at Hliuboke there, as they came down into the eastern side of Kupyansk, still within the confines of the eastern bank side of the Oskil River there. They are attacking actually over the river further to the north there. So that is also a problem for the Ukrainians. And we have another map here further north of Dvorichna there, where they appear to be attacking. So that is up here towards Hliuboke there, so in that direction. This is all pretty challenging for the Ukrainians, I would think. And not only that, they are gaining not actually at the Oskil River around the Pischani sector, but further south and pushing their whole front further to the west around Stelmakivka and southwest of Brestok, just up there. So the Russians, as you can see, Andrew Perpetua has moved his mapping quite considerably forward, and Suriyak Maps even further to the west from where they previously had the Russian lines. So more successes there. Slight success around Turney for the Russians, just half a field really, nothing to report too significantly. And then when we come down past Siversk, quiet there, which is good news. Quiet on the northern Bakhmut front, good news. And even in Chasiv, good news for the Ukrainians, according to Suriyak Maps, is that they've pushed the Russians back in Chasiv, or it could have been some overzealous mapping originally. That's west of the canal here, where they have taken some serious, central part, if you like, of Chasiv, but possibly the Ukrainians giving them a run for their money over there, and a slight rejig just further south as well. Then when we come to Andrew Perpetua's mapping in the Drozdbe area, which is part of the Toretsk sector, you got New York down here, Toretsk, Russians fighting through Toretsk. Suriyak map showing that they're making some progress in the middle of Toretsk as well as in the southern outskirts. But the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back along the railway line at Drozdbe, back towards Mayorsk, which is over here. So that's good news for the Ukrainians there, as according to Andrew Perpetua. I'm rushing through this quite a bit just because a lot of content out today. So sorry, this is skimming the details somewhat. No change to the northern part of the Prokrosk front, but there are some pretty significant changes otherwise. In fact, if we go to some sources here, General Sursky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainians, has said in the Donetsk, Prokrosk and Kurakhove directions, units will be reinforced with the reserves. I don't know who and when and how many. There's also talk of additional reinforcements with ammunition, or reinforcement with ammunition, weapons and military equipment. Now, talking before actually we get to Kurakhove, it's all kind of joined together here, this whole front now. But you can see that the Russians are pushing further to the west around Prokrosk, which is challenging because the main trench line is just around there. I don't know whether they've got up under that trench line and are pushing now north to try and cut this road that comes south from Prokrosk all the way down here. They're dangerously close to that, and it will be under somewhat fire control. But yes, certainly both mappers agreeing that the Russians are pushing on right along all these fronts. We've got Kurakhove, if you remember, south of the reservoir here. The Russians are pushing north through Ilinka, so they control that now, and they've now taken control of Brestok, as according to both mappers. Having control of that village, a little bit of difference up in the field area between the reservoir and Novosilka up there. And then south of the reservoir around Kurakhove, the Russians pushing through Kurakhove, now controlling easily half of the town and pushing on further towards the south here at north of Dalnie. And if you remember, there's a east-west trench line, major trench line there that they will be seeking to push themselves along. It's all looking pretty dicey for the Ukrainians there. Now, interestingly, a bit of a rejig possibly for Andrew here, but some major differences between the two. It could be a counterattack by the Ukrainians. The Russian lines further to the east, actually, north of this other Ilinka, along this river of several settlements that kind of it doesn't end in Stelmakivka, but you get another road there, and then that's where we're expecting the Russians to push the Ukrainians back to fairly easily, but actually the Ukrainians still giving the Russians a hard time there. Some gains for the Russians on the southern part of this Donetsk front line, but again, the Ukrainians possibly pushing the Russians back a little bit around this Drozdbe area. There's quite a bit of video coming out from Drozdbe. Quite a lot of fighting there. The Russians are losing quite a lot of equipment in this area, as you would expect, as they often do, but it doesn't really stop them, does it? Anyway, before we go on, because we'll carry on going towards the west there, some Russian, I'd ignore those two blue ones, Russian gains around the fields just north of Maksimivka, there. We'll leave it there from what I'm saying, but we're going to be talking about this area. So first of all, Null reports states that bad news is coming from this Velyka Novosilka direction. Russians were actually that should be next. We'll come on to that afterwards, because actually that is going further to the west there. But first of all, we'll go to an ML Castelhaimi analysis from the Blackbird group. So this autumn has been grim for Ukraine. According to our assessment, between the 1st of September and 30th of November, the Russians captured over 1,600 square kilometers and retook roughly 500 square kilometers of Kursk. The rate of advance accelerated every month despite the Russians suffering heavy losses. So you've got Prokrosk getting closer to there, Kurakhove pretty much taken out, Velyka Novosilka looking very, very vulnerable. And you can see the vast swathes of land that they have taken, really relatively quickly compared to what they have previously achieved. Now, already at the end of the summer, the situation seemed to be developing in a worrying direction, especially in August. The Russians' gains were relatively large, and it did not seem like the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk would significantly slow down the Russians. During the autumn, while making progress in Ukraine, Russia also conducted several counterattacks in Kursk. Ukraine lost the western flank of the salient while also losing positions in the east. Between September and November, Ukraine didn't advance significantly in the area. So this is Kursk. This is the amount that they've lost. Pretty much half of the entire area that they had taken. So it was about 40%. Now it looks like it's going to be about 50%. So that's unfortunate, but it has done its job, Kursk. It's whether, maintaining that area is still useful for the Ukrainians compared to defending other areas of the front line. That's always been the calculus. The main focus of the Russian offensive this autumn has been the area of Prokrosk and Kurakhove. In November, after the loss of Vuhledar, Russians also advanced quickly to Velyka Novosilka. Currently, most of the changes on the front line are happening on a 140-kilometer section. Russians are pressuring elsewhere too, but have not gained much in the big picture. Ukrainians held the Donetsk, Chasiv, Siversk direction well, denying Russians any greater progress in the northern Donetsk sector. The front in Zaporizhia didn't see much change during the autumn either. So you've got fairly quiet around, really, from New York up to Siversk. There have been some changes, but it's been much more limited compared to what it was. In Kupyansk, the Russians managed to advance on the Oskil River, cutting the Ukrainian presence there in half. However, this can be considered a secondary front without very significant opportunities for the Russians, regardless of whether they are on the river or not. I mean, I've said before that they can take all of this area up to Oskil River, and it's not really that significant. I think if Kupyansk goes, that's more of a problem. But this kind of area down here is not the worst in the world to lose that. The only problem is whatever you lose, you have to get back diplomatically, invariably, and that is certainly a challenge going forward. What can we expect from the rest of the year? Based on the current trends, the Russians are likely to continue their offensive in the Prokrosk-Karakivka-Velyka Novosilka direction. It can be expected that additional 500 to 700 square kilometers of Ukrainian land will be occupied. Kurakhove and Velyka Novosilka may fall. I think they pretty much are going to, for sure. Russia will likely try to continue advancing in Kursk too, but concentrating very heavy forces there wouldn't be the best usage of their troops. However, the same applies to Ukraine. Reserves would be needed elsewhere, as the Eastern Front has had constant setbacks for months. I've been posting a bit less. Okay, so that's not too important to go to the rest of that. But yeah, challenging times for the Ukrainians, really up and down those front lines, aren't they? And then Velyka Novosilka, no report says bad news coming from there. Russians were located in Novyi Komar, cutting the highway to Prokrosk and seriously putting remaining Ukrainian forces near Velyka Novosilka at risk. The Ukrainians look to have retreated beyond the Mokry Yali River. Right, so that's pretty challenging for the Ukrainians. Let's go and have a look at that. That's north of Velyka Novosilka, so we can see that they are making these considerable gains. And then here's the area Novyi Komar. So both mappers agree that the Russians have got into that to some degree. That is north of Velyka Novosilka, and that means you're starting to get a bit of a chance of operationally encircling Velyka Novosilka, particularly if they continue making these gains further to the west and up the Mokry Yali River there. It looks pretty inevitable that they're going to lose these Makarivka, Storozheve, Neskuchna. Goodness me, I remember when Neskuchna was being fought over previously. Vremivka and up to Velyka Novosilka. Is the writing on the wall for Velyka Novosilka? I would have thought so to some. It's just a matter of when. And then some slight gains further to the east, just around Novodorivka. They seem to have taken that settlement as well. So not looking good for the Ukrainians in this area of neck of the woods. Prokrosk is typically challenging. And then actually Chasiv Yar and Donetsk aren't looking too bad. This getting across the Oskil River up there, I think, is a concern. And it's going to be interesting to see what the Russians and the Ukrainians make of Kursk. Who is going to have the ability to control that by sort of January the 20th. The idea is that the Russians want that. Putin wants that by the time the inauguration of Trump happens. This is an important bargaining chip for Ukraine, and it'll be worth much more land than that is in terms of square kilometers. compared to Ukrainian land. So we shall see if they try and hold on to that, or whether holding on ad infinitum or for as long as possible is too attritional for them. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, that's enough from me. I really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.